The Story of HAVARIAN, Part the Second. Renar's Surrender. The story thus far. HAVARIAN, a young and privileged High Hanath lord, is spending time as a guest in the estates of Lord Jovan, accompanied by his attendants Cressa and Eli. After he rides foolishly into a dangerous marshy area, where he and his horse come close to death, HAVARIAN's life is saved by a young slave, Renar, a surviving member of a horse tribe, generally thought to have been wiped out almost a decade ago. HAVARIAN is shocked at Lord Jovan's brutality, especially towards the stable boy. One of the horses has died of poison, and Renar, though grieving, is given the cruel task of skinning the animal before burning the tainted flesh. The story continues. When they were alone, Cressa said, "That horseboy will kill him one day. He'll drive him to it." Eli countered, "Anyone who weeps over a dead horse is not a natural killer." HAVARIAN nodded. They were both right. Murder was not in the boy's nature. But anyone could be pushed beyond his limits. It was afternoon when they gathered for another ride, this being how long it took to clean the blood and guts from the stones of the courtyard. Jovan's son and his mother joined them as they approached the stables, and all heard at the same time the grunting sounds coming from just inside the wooden building. The interior was dark, and as their eyes adjusted, all they could make out was a pair of pale hands gripping a crossbar in one of the stalls. Two clenched hands, and the top of a shaggy head of multicoloured hair. The noise was coming from Jovan as he thrust savagely into the silent slave, crowing with delight when he reached his crisis, then leaning forward to ruffle Renar's head as if he were a dog. A good dog. When he pulled away, Renar crumbled silently into the straw as Jovan wiped himself and adjusted his clothes. He was in a marvellous mood and looking forward to the ride. He smiled happily at his wife and son. This was the first time that Bram had seen Jovan actually lay hands on Renar. He had always thought that the stable boy was like one of those simpering wretches that fawned on his father, lesser nobles, second sons, who offered themselves without any shame, in the hope of some favour, some small advantage. Certainly his mother thought so. She had said often enough that Jovan's bestial behaviour had begun the day he brought that wicked boy home. He was a corrupting influence, a seducer who had reduced her home to a whorehouse by his influence on her husband. It had never once occurred to her son that Renar might be unwilling in all this. Bram turned pale, wondering if he would be sick, looked up at his mother's face, which was white with rage. She said nothing, but turned the boy around, back to the main building, where she began organizing slaves to pack their belongings. They needed to get away from this place for a while. Perhaps a long stay with her brother might clean away the disgusting taste of what she had just witnessed. Jovan smiled at that, satisfied to see them go. He had reasons of his own for not wanting them on the ride. It would take HAVARIAN some time to realize that this violent and very public abuse of Renar had been timed with exactly that in mind. Their host waved to his guests to pick out the horses they would take, yelling at the stable boys to assist them. It was a few minutes before Renar joined them. His face was white but impassive. He was wearing a long-sleeved tunic, sturdy breeches, and a sleeveless hide jacket, worn with the fur on the inside. Clearly he was anticipating severe weather. When he looked up at HAVARIAN, already mounted, he shook his head. "You will be too cold." HAVARIAN smiled at him. "What should I wear?" Renar put a hand on his own jerkin. I rather think yours would be too small for me." Renar put up a hand to help him dismount. "We have others." He led Havarian to a dark storeroom where he could just make out winter jackets in several sizes. Renar picked one out and helped him with it, leaning close as he shucked it over the man's shoulders and whispering softly but clearly, "Don't eat the berries." "Are you done?" Jovan had left his own horse, apparently unwilling to leave these two alone together. Renar turned aside as though he had lost all interest, leaving Havarian to fasten the ties for himself, as he started looking for slightly smaller jerkins that might fit Cressa and Eli. He stood still, his head bowed, as Jovan smiled at him and ran a possessive hand over his chest, before jerking his head and saying, "Get on with it." They travelled for a couple of hours, mostly uphill through a densely wooded area, with the snow ankle-deep all around them. When the trees parted to afford a clear view of the valley below them, they stopped to admire the landscape from this level and to take some food and drink. Jovan's magnificent estates were laid out in the plains below them. They had perhaps 2 more hours before the sun would begin to set, and they would need to turn back before then. Jovan watched as Havarian politely eschewed the gojan berries and opted instead for fresh bread and farmhouse cheese. His host scowled. "We brought those especially for you, since you liked them so much." Havarian nodded. "I thank you for that. I did enjoy them, you're right, but I think I may have overindulged. I felt quite queasy afterwards, and the smell now makes me a little nauseated." It was the truth. A truth. Like any well-raised Hanath noble, he would have struggled to lie, so he offered a truth, one that was perhaps less true than his real reason for avoiding the fruit, but true all the same. Jovan was displeased, and when Cressa enthusiastically offered to enjoy them instead, he threw the berries into the snow. Havarian spared a thought for the local animals that might come upon them. Would they be killed, or merely dulled enough to be easier to attack? It was only a short while later that Havarian found himself far ahead of the others, much higher on the hillside, separated from any sight of the rest by the closely packed trees. Only Renar was at his side. The slave was alert, looking around him as though he could smell Targ. He heard the sound of the bolus as it flew. Then Renar was careening into him and knocking him from his horse. The slave groaned aloud as they hit the ground. One heavy metal sphere of the weapon had caught him in the back, possibly breaking one of his ribs. Havarian was a little dazed by the sudden fall, and watched dumbly as Renar rose to his feet and pulled from his belt the curved knife he wore. A Targ claw, Havarian now realized. A huge Targ claw with an intricately hand-carved wooden handle. Razor sharp. Renar put himself between Havarian and the 2 older stable hands as they rode up, shielding the fallen man and staring them down. "Don't be stupid, he'll kill us all." The grey-haired one looked down at Renar with understanding, perhaps even compassion, but with angry determination. Renar shook his head. "Not if we're quick. Not if he dies today." Havarian watched in confusion as Jovan arrived, as always cruelly urging his mount to move ever faster. This was planned. They had deliberately separated him from the rest of the group. He saw that now. His host dropped from his horse and grinned at Havarian as he pulled his own dagger. He was astonished when Renar picked up Havarian's short sword and held it out, point towards him, said softly, "You will not kill him." There was a moment's shocked silence. Even the simple act of picking up a real edged weapon, a real metal sword, for any reason other than to clean it, Well, it was a death sentence. Renar was putting his own life at terrible risk, first by refusing to obey his master in the conspiracy to kill this man, and now by threatening him with a weapon. This latter alone was tantamount to suicide. Havarian pushed himself to his feet, gently taking the sword from Renar's hand. "You deal with the servants." Jovan laughed as he pulled out his own sword, his face dark with rage as he launched his attack. When in his cups, he often boasted of his prowess with the sword, but he had never met a truly gifted swordsman, and had certainly never fought anyone like Havarian. Indeed, he had never fought against anyone who had not simply let him win. In less than a minute he was on his knees, his sword and his dagger both in the snow, laughing into his would-be victim's face. He hissed, "You would never kill me. How would you explain my death?" Havarian stared at him silently as he began to roar. "Do you really think you can reach the foot of this mountain alive? That I won't find a way to kill you?" Jovan looked around at the stable boys. "All of you!" At which point Renar, approaching from behind, leaned around and cut his throat with his targ-clawed dagger. Havarian was speechless with shock. Then he found his voice and began to babble, to stutter in disbelief. What did you just... You've killed him while I watched. You've made me a witness. Do you not know? Do you know what the law says, what my honor says? What I should do now, what I should do to you?" His sword arm hung limply. Renar had saved his life, more than once. His duty was simple and clear, but he did not want to kill this man. Renar carefully wiped his blade and returned it to his belt. Then he pulled off the fur-lined jerkin and dropped it in the snow. He loosened his tunic, pulling it down to his waist, baring his chest to the cold. He was calm as he smiled gently at Havarian. The same reassuring smile he had given the horse that hurt him that day in the stable-yard. He put his hands, palms outwards, at his sides and nodded. Complete surrender. It was okay, his smile said. He had known it would come to this, that this would be the consequence, the price he would pay for his decision. Then he whispered, "Send me to my family," and closed his eyes. Havarian looked on horrified, until he was distracted by the other two stablemen who were rolling Jovan's still bleeding corpse onto its back. Each drew a targ claw, each dragged it across the dead man's flesh, one across his lower face, the other through his shirt and across his chest. Now there were 3 wounds, 3 parallel targ claw wounds, as if an angry targ had swiped him across the face, and most unfortunately cut his throat in the process. Havarian took a step backwards as they approached him, raised his sword, but they wiped their daggers and rapidly tucked them away. The older man spoke. "This is what we were instructed to do to you, my lord. Murder you and make it look like a targ attack. You are alive because this stubborn fucking boy would not agree to kill you." He looked hard at this soft, pampered lord, willing him to understand quickly before the others could arrive. "If you two go now, before the rest come, we will tell the tale. You will not have to lie, even though Jovan would have lied willingly enough over your bloody corpse." He watched as Havarian struggled with the idea. "Spare the boy," he insisted. "He knew it might cost him all, but he would not kill you. You owe him your life." He turned his head, listening hard for the sound of the other horses. "Spare him, and spare us for helping him. He's not the only one that will die." He looked at Havarian, held out his palms, anxiously appealing to him to make haste. You must decide now, right now. I beg you, ride on. More snow is coming. Take shelter for a couple of days. When you get back, this will all be over." Renar was turning blue in the cold, but his eyes were open again, and he was watching Havarian with mild interest, clearly wondering what choice he would make. At last Havarian sheathed his sword and said, "Get your clothes on. Let's go." The two older stablemen began frantically churning up the snow around Jovan's corpse to resemble the traces left by a Targ attack, while Renar, hesitating only slightly, covered his naked chest and readied himself to leave. He took a moment to look into Havarian's face. The man's decision had come as a surprise. He was not yet sure what to make of it all. In a very few minutes Havarian and Renar were heading onwards, further upwards into the forest, leaving the two other stablemen to explain the tragic accident that had befallen their master, Lord Jovan. By the time the rest of the group reached the scene of Jovan's death, exclaimed in horror over Jovan's corpse, and accepted without question that Havarian and Renar were far ahead, and that they in all likelihood knew nothing of the Targ attack, by this time the sky was darkening. They would be very lucky to reach the lower levels before total darkness fell. As the two older stable hands wrapped the body and tied it across his horse's back, Cressa and Eli were becoming apprehensive. What of my Lord Havarian? If he is so far ahead, how will he get back before dark? Even they knew that crossing the plain between the forest and the gates of the estate was not something that a wise man would choose to do at night, unless he were hunting wolves or Targ. The grey-haired horseman nodded, acknowledging their fears. "Young master, he's with Renar, the youngest and best of us. He will keep your lord safe." And Cressa and Eli had to accept that. They knew that the body must be taken away at once, before foraging predators became aware of the easy meal that was waiting for them, and that neither of them could contribute any useful skill in the search for Havarian. Indeed, it was highly unlikely that they would make it back to the estates without help. With great reluctance they turned back and left Havarian to his fate, in the hands of a slave who had little reason to care what became of a Hanath lord, if he stood in the way of his escape from brutal servitude. It would be several days before they saw their lord again. Renar and Havarian pushed on in silence, higher and colder, before the advancing twilight stopped them. Renar had spotted a small clearing where they could make camp, and he started stripping lower leaves from the surrounding trees. This served to make the opening large enough for the horses to bed down, and created a soft mulch for them to lie on. He looked at Havarian's sword, then into his face. "Help me," he said simply. Havarian frowned. "This is not an axe. It is a family heirloom. Renar looked gently at him. "Do you want to survive?" Havarian looked down at him. Without this man's aid, his advice, he would die here. He nodded his head and did as he was bid. Over the next hour and a half, Havarian worked until he sweated, until he was filthy, learned how to make a fire, how to gather stones to throw into the fire to warm the inside of the shelter, how to strip thin branches, to build a basic structure and weave finer ones crosswise to make a basket work that could support more leaves, how to gather snow to melt for water, how to dig for roots that they could throw into a boiling pot to make a thin soup that under other circumstances he would have thought pitiful. Right here, right now, it was marvelous, even though they shared a bowl like hunting dogs. Havarian pushed aside his delicate manners and drank greedily. They lit lamps that they had built from wood and moss and metal wires that Renar carried. Creating a mesh over the flame, that meant they were a little less likely to set their shelter on fire. When at last they crawled inside, it was surprisingly warm. On 2 sides the horses had folded their paws beneath them and huddled down to sleep. Their bodies provided insulation, and the heap of stones, heated in the fire, a direct source of warmth. They kept their clothes on, and HAVARIAN watched with interest as Renar pulled from each pack a blanket. Did he always carry these, or had he planned it as part of their escape? Renar saw his look and said, "You never travel without a blanket." HAVARIAN was becoming sleepy as he listened to Renar repeat his instructions. If you need to relieve yourself, do not walk out alone. Go nowhere alone. He nodded as he stretched out, frowned when he was offered a lumpy pack for a pillow, but did not complain. When Renar lay down beside him, sharing the blankets, his back against HAVARIAN's shoulder, he said, "I have to ask you something." Renar rolled over and looked at him, close enough to feel each other's breath. After a moment of silence, Renar patiently waiting for HAVARIAN to speak, again without the usual words of blandishment and encouragement that the Lord was used to, HAVARIAN finally said carefully, "No one could blame you for hating him. He was a despicable man. He treated you abominably. I have never seen such wicked behavior." He stopped, aware that he was talking too much, especially compared to this habitually silent man. "I need to know, did you kill him to save me, or because you hated him?" Renar thought, "Not just you. He would have killed all of us." HAVARIAN nodded his understanding. Then Renar blinked and added, "Hating him helped." HAVARIAN looked at those light grey eyes. "You were only in danger, you and the others, because you refused to kill me." Renar nodded. That was true. But why? Why did he want me dead? Did he tell you? Renar dropped his gaze and was silent for a long time. Eventually HAVARIAN said, "Tell me." Renar looked up at him. "Because I smiled at you." HAVARIAN stared. Then, as Renar began to turn away, he said, wait a moment. I have to know. Why? Why wouldn't you kill me?" "Why?" Renar took his time before he said, "Because you smiled at me." Then he sat up, pulled over the leather hood of the torch to extinguish it, turned his back, and made it obvious that he was going to sleep. Temperatures fell sharply over the next 2 days. HAVARIAN felt as though he would never be warm again. Snow built up around the shelter, and he was given the task of digging for roots, while Renar took the bigger of the 2 horses hunting. Renar walked him a short distance away from their base to relieve himself, and then showed him how to bury all the evidence that they had been there. He was not happy that he was leaving this ignorant man to fend for himself, even for a few hours, but he could see no help for it. He repeated all his warnings, then took off deeper into the forest. It was perhaps 3 hours before he returned with 4 fat rabbits and a handful of eggs. 2 of the rabbits went at once to the horses, who chewed them whole, skin and skull and bone. Meanwhile, he quickly skinned the other 2 and prepared to add them to the soup. He was grateful to see that several new roots had been added to the mix. He sniffed carefully, reassuring himself that nothing toxic had been foraged by the inexperienced lord. He was smiling when he crawled into the shelter, but the smile fell from his face when he saw HAVARIAN. He was shivering, grey-faced, wet. Renar pushed a hand below the man's jerkin, wet through to the skin, clammy, damp skin. HAVARIAN said, "Hey," mildly protesting the familiarity, but Renar asked, "Did it rain here?" HAVARIAN shrugged. "I think I just brushed the trees while I was foraging." Renar looked at him. He blamed himself. He had forgotten just how stupid, how helpless they could be. "How long?" When Havarian looked confused, he said, "How long have you been wet?" Havarian was already too bewildered to answer, and he was further surprised when Renar began pulling at his clothes. The first night was not the worst. Havarian, stripped, was able to eat a little of the rabbit stew and one of the eggs, and he fell asleep under the warm blankets, while Renar did what he could to dry his clothes. The shelter became oppressively hot as he brought more and more hot stones inside. Eventually he stripped off his own clothing and climbed beneath the blankets to share his body heat with the shivering lord. He knew worse was coming when he opened his eyes in the early hours, to see Havarian above him, smiling, leaning down to kiss him. Renar tolerated the gentle kiss without comment. He'd never been kissed, and it wasn't unpleasant. But far more worrying, Havarian's face was flushed and hot, sweating. His eyes were glazed. He did not seem to know quite where he was, and certainly did not know who Renar was. Satisfied with the kiss, Havarian settled down again, curling into his side, hugging him. Renar wondered idly who the Lord had taken him for, and allowed himself to enjoy the extra warmth produced by his feverish companion. When the dawn came, the rain began. He dared not try to get Havarian onto a horse until the weather changed, so they spent a full day and a night huddled in the shelter while Havarian sweltered and talked to himself, complaining of the heat, and Renar did his best to keep him from throwing off his clothes. He would not eat, but he drank some warm water with fever-bane. His temperature dropped a little then, and he slept. Renar watched him sleep, going over in his mind all the conversations he had listened to, an unseen observer, as Havarian talked of his fond wish to travel in the uncharted north. Jovan had been right when he said that Renar would be the perfect guide for such an adventure. He could lead this man to his home and the lands beyond, if he survived. The next morning was dry, and there was more snow in the air. Renar knew he needed to get his charge back to the estate where a doctor could treat him, before the weather trapped them again. Hopefully his delirium would not undo them both. He would not blurt out everything they had done when asked what he knew about Jovan's death. Havarian could not sit upright in the saddle. An hour's work produced a makeshift travois that Renar attached to the back of the horse before strapping the semi-conscious Havarian onto it. It worked well enough, but it was slow, and Renar had to stop twice to deal with wolves that had picked up the scent. Most Hanath horses can kill a wolf without breaking a sweat, but the second encounter gave him pause. There were 6 wolves working together. Unusual. It must have been a hard winter for the normally solitary animals to cooperate like this, and both he and his horse's flank bore fresh scars before they were all dead. Renar chose one of the smaller animals, used snow to wipe the blood from its snout, then picked it up and shook it, allowing the snow to fall from its pelt. Then he carefully laid its corpse alongside Havarian, partly for the warmth, partly as a warning to any other wolves who picked up their scent. That gave them an hour of uninterrupted travel before a deafening targ roar close by spooked the second horse, and he broke into a fast run with the travois, Havarian, and the wolf corpse dragging and bouncing behind him. By the time Renar caught him and soothed him, the travois was in pieces, broken apart on the rough terrain. Renar looked at the sun, decided there was not enough time to build another. Eventually he ditched the second saddle, hiding it where he was confident he could find it again, then strapped Havarian face down onto the horse's back. Covering him with blankets, his head resting on the stallion's broad rump. It was undignified, but it was the quickest way to get him back to the estate. They rode as fast as Renar dared, watching all the time to see that the unconscious Havarian was still attached to his horse. By late afternoon he could feel the icy sting of the snowstorm that was coming, and it became a race to get the High Hanath Lord to safety before the new snow drenched them again. Men rode out to meet them from the estate as soon as they were sighted, and relieved the exhausted Renar of his burden. He was shaking now, pushed to his limit, and worn out with the anxiety of caring for this man who had earned himself a death sentence by smiling at him and feeding him a few gojan berries, and who had chosen to spare him when everything he had been taught about honour and duty screamed at him to execute him as a murderer. He was not given the time to dismount before he was challenged. The major domo, chief servant of the estate, once he had given orders for the care of the unconscious Havarian, demanded to know what had become of the second saddle. He nodded as Renar explained how he had made the decision to save the Lord's life at the cost of leaving the saddle behind. In a matter of minutes, Renar found himself with 2 fresh horses, one for himself, a second without a saddle. He was to retrieve his master's property before thinking of resting or feeding himself. And so, wearily, he set out again into the oncoming snowstorm. The sun was setting by the time he came back with the abandoned saddle. He was frozen to the bone, faint from hunger, and weary beyond anything he had known before. He was coughing, he could feel the start of a fever, but above all, he wanted to know what had become of Havarian. He threw the reins of the 2 horses to the waiting stable hands, pausing long enough to make eye contact with the eldest, watched his face for signs of warning, of danger. But there was nothing. They had been believed. So he turned swiftly to the main house. He muttered a few words to his family gods as he made his way to the guest rooms, Lord Havarian's rooms. Let it be true that he had brought him back in time, that the doctors had been able to treat him, to cure his fever. Let it be so. Grant Renar the chance to kneel before the man and beg. Let him entreat Havarian to buy him, to take him away from this hell that he had endured for almost a decade. Please let it be so. It was a long time since he had felt hope, and it gave him an unfamiliar pain in the chest as he made his way to the guest rooms, the rooms where he had been bathed in sandalwood-scented water by Havarian's friends, who had taken pity on him when they found him, frozen and half-starved, outside the kitchen. The rooms were deserted. The beds were stripped, the fresh flowers gone, the baggage that Havarian and his party had brought with them gone. They would tell him later in the kitchen that his attendants had bundled him into his carriage, covered him with furs, and ridden hard for his home and his own doctors. For now he looked around at the empty room, frozen in disbelief. He had begun to believe this man would save him from this misery. He had pictured in his mind their travels together to the north, smiled as he fell asleep, imagining how much better his life might become. It had given him the strength he needed to make his way back with that damned saddle, to go on when all his body wanted to do was to lie down in the snow and sleep and die. And now he was gone. Just gone. He knelt on the floor and put his head in his hands. After a while he sat back on his heels, noticed a speck of light on the floor to his right, a minuscule reflection that moved when he moved his head. It was a small amber bead, shaped like a perfect teardrop. Renar picked it up, looked at it as it lay in his palm. He recognized it as coming from the extravagantly ornate jacket that Havarian had worn on the day he arrived. A piece of Havarian, a tiny souvenir, a keepsake of the man who so nearly saved him. He closed his hand around the bead, trembling, coughed for a long time, then reminded himself that there were horses to be cared for, and stumbled wearily to his feet.